Good morning and welcome to Lesson 3 in our study of the book of Daniel. And this is going to cover the first chapter, verses 10 to 21, the rest of the first chapter. Now if you just read this story through, you'll see that previously King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon conquered Judea and took back with him to Babylon some of the treasures of the temple of Judah, and also some of the best young men. And these he took into his own fold, so to speak, put them in the charge of his chief eunuch, and made them, or took them up in the culture and in the language of Babylon. And he gave them 3 years to do this. He also gave them off his food, off his table, from his own table, the king's delicacies, the wine which the king drank, and the food which the king ate. He gave this to Daniel and his other captives. And he did this in a way which was apparently to give them the best foods of the kingdom. But as we see now, starting in verse 10, there's a little change in this, because Daniel had previously agreed with himself not to eat this food, not to do what he considered to be sacrilege in the face of God. And he said that the eunuch said to him that the king wanted him to eat this food because he did not want them to become wasted and look worse than other people. He wanted them to become robust and strong, and Daniel made this deal with himself that he would not do this. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had sent over him, "Please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink, and let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants." So he made this deal with the chief steward. He wanted to eat just water and vegetables, and then to be compared with the other people who ate the king's delicacies. So he persuaded the steward to consent to this, and so he, the steward, consented with them in this situation and tested them 10 days. At the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. And as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought to the chief eunuch, the chief of the eunuchs brought them before Nebuchadnezzar. And the interview went well, and he found that in all matters of wisdom and understanding, about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. If you just read the story, this looks like a situation in which one kingdom was defeated by another. There were captives taken in. They were indoctrinated in the culture and the language of the nation to which they were taken. They did do something their own way. They did do something which they felt God wanted them to do, and they turned out better than the others who went in a different direction. And as a result, they were rewarded by the king. But if you look at this just from a political and a historical point of view, this is the whole story, but this is not the whole story, because this is also a religious change. And if you go back to the first part of the chapter, it says that they took items from the house of God back to the house of their God in Babylon. And this really is a religious situation in which it seems as if the God of the Israelites was being defeated by the God of the Babylonians. So this was on a religious level different than just on a political level. And it says also that they took back people, some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish. So these were people who had no defects, people who had no apparent handicaps of any type. And when it says without blemish, it almost looks like it was a situation in which it's referring to the same, the lamb with no blemish that was to be sacrificed before God. The lambs with no blemish, and Christ himself had no blemish. So there's a correlation here between those features with no blemish and these young men with no blemish, because they were to stand before the king. And as a result of that, there is an indication that these people were not just to be brought before the king as servants, they were to be brought before the king almost as priests to the god Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar in those days was considered a god, as most rulers were considered themselves and were considered by their people to be gods. The Egyptian pharaohs were considered gods. The Roman emperors were considered, or wanted to be considered, divine and as gods. In most of the pagan countries, their rulers had some type of deity attached to them, and so Nebuchadnezzar did as well. And therefore, the idea of these young men serving Nebuchadnezzar, appearing and standing before him, is very similar to the idea of some priests serving gods at a time of previous sacrifices in other cultures. So this idea of no blemish carries on through this scenario. And then the fact that they gave them the king's delicacies, he wanted to give them the king's delicacies, the meats and the wines, which the king himself apparently ate, and therefore it would be indicative that they were also served to the gods, and that they had been served to what Daniel and his friends considered idols. And therefore they did not do this because he could not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies. This is why he requested that he be served only vegetables and water. Now it's said in the very first of this that God gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. It wasn't that Nebuchadnezzar's army or forces were that much greater, but because of the deficiencies in Israel, because of the paganization of Israel, because they had not kept the Sabbath week or year as they were instructed to do, that God gave Judah into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. And now it says that God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs, because they had to agree to Daniel's idea. So God gave Daniel favor in the eyes of the chief of the eunuchs, and this is why this steward agreed to Daniel's suggestion. It was also probably due in part to this suggestion was made with respect and with dignity and with quietness. It was not made in any kind of antagonistic or confrontational type of atmosphere. So the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, "I fear for my life if you don't do what the king wants you to do." But Daniel had already felt in his heart that he could not defile his own ideas of dietary laws, that God had given to them previously, by eating the food which had been apparently given to idols or the king. And this is why he made this agreement. Try it for 10 days, and after 10 days, see who is the better. So the eunuch, the chief of the eunuch, the chief steward, agreed to this. Now, this is probably because of the way in which God gave Daniel the wisdom to do this. It says in James 3:17, "The wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy." And this is the type of wisdom which Daniel displayed when he made this agreement. with its steward of the eunuchs. It says in Psalm 141:4, "Do not incline my heart to any evil thing, to produce wisdom works with men who work in work integrity, and do not let me out of their deliveries. Do not let me eat of their delicacies." So the idea was, do not let people eat of the delicacies because of some people who work iniquity. In Proverbs 23:2 it says, "Do not desire of his delicacies, for they are deceptive food." This is what Daniel's trying to do here. He's avoiding these delicacies by making this arrangement with the stewards. So they eat the vegetables. Now, the vegetables listed here do not just mean the vegetables that we think of vegetables, but anything which came from the ground, wheat and grain and herbs. The vegetables, the same type of food which God gave to us to eat back in Genesis chapter 2. But none of the meats and of the delicacies of the processed type of meals that would be given to the king. So they did this for 10 days, and then they found that their appearance was even better than those who had eaten of the king's food. And at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the king's men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. So therefore the steward gave them what they wanted to eat on a full-time basis. And when they came before the king to be tested after 3 years, he found them better in understanding and wisdom and knowledge and all sorts of ideas as far as they're 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in his realm. And it says here again that God gave them the knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. God gave Jehoiakim into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. God brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And now God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And we have to realize that most of what happens, if not all of what happens in this world, we don't do it ourselves. It's God's will. It's God's ability to give or to withhold. And this is what he's doing to Daniel. He's giving him the ability to pass the king's test so that he will be in the area of the king's fortune and king's favor. And he remained in this favor of the king right until the end of his life. Now, it says in the last line, Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. This story begins with the defeat of Judah by the Babylonians. And this chapter ends at the time when the Babylonians are defeated by the Persians. And so the whole time through the Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, through the Medo-Persian Empire which followed them, and through and up to the time of the Persian Empire, Daniel remained. In fact, he remained in Babylon for the rest of his life. He never left and came back to his hometown of Judah. So it says that thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. And it says back in Ezra that when, in the first chapter of Ezra, in the first year of King Cyrus, the Jewish people were released to go back to their own homeland of Judah, thus completing the 70 years that they were in captivity in Babylon, and the 70 years which completed the 70 years of Sabbaths, which the Jewish people had not followed during the time since King Solomon. For 490 years, the Jewish people had not kept the 7th year Sabbath, in which the fields were supposed to lie fallow and not be used, and so they could regain their nutrition and regain their goodness. This was not done. And now, after the conquest of Judah by Babylon, there were 70 years. 70 times 7, in which the fields were not done, were not used, and so they lay fallow for all this period of time. Numbers in the Bible mean things. And so we have to look at the number 10 in this section. Why did Daniel say 10 days for the trial and for the test? Why not some other time? Why not some other period of time? It's hard to know for certain, but there's one possible scenario, because this is a religious type of text, a spiritual type of story, after all. Look at the number 10. The number 10 was, there were 10 commandments. It is a number of completion. And if you go back and look at the time of the feasts of Israel, there is in the fall the Feast of Trumpets. And there is after that a time of preparation to be judged by God up to the Day of Atonement, which is 10 days after the Feast of Trumpets. After that, the Day of Atonement, people are judged by God. Daniel's name means to be judged by God. And so perhaps he chose the 10 days knowing that this would be a completion of time after which God would judge him on what he did and how he maintained the Jewish laws of food and nutrition and avoided eating the Babylonian food that had been offered to him, even though it was probably of a better quality than the nutrition and the vegetables which he ate. But because he followed God's direction and followed the laws of Leviticus, giving him what foods to eat, because he did this, because Daniel had been brought by God into the favor of the eunuchs, and because he maintained his faith in God, then God allowed him to become better, more nutritious, more advanced in wisdom and knowledge, and brought him into the favor of King Nebuchadnezzar, so he could be in a position where he could influence that kingdom for the rest of his days. So this is the end of chapter 1. And it shows how Daniel became into the favor, was brought by God into the favor of King Nebuchadnezzar, and how he maintained his relationship with God even though in a pagan country. It continues to show man's obedience and God's sovereignty, which are the two main features of this entire book. So next time we'll start chapter 2 and get into some of the more advanced part of Daniel's story. But for now, we'll end it there for today. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me next week. Bye for now.